There's a traffic jam on the Kazakhstan-Russia border that's been growing for days, and it might be the most consequential traffic jam in modern geopolitical history. Over 8,000 commercial trucks are currently immobilized, stretching in lines that extend for kilometers. Drivers are sleeping in their cabs. Goods worth hundreds of millions of dollars are sitting idle. Contracts are being breached. Companies are facing bankruptcy. And this isn't because of weather, infrastructure failure, or some random bureaucratic snafu. This is deliberate. Kazakhstan just flipped a switch that could fundamentally alter the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine, and most people have no idea it's happening. Here's what changed overnight. Kazakhstani border officials went from inspecting roughly 1 to 2% of cargo entering Russia to inspecting up to 99% of shipments. That's not a policy adjustment. That's a complete transformation of how the border functions. And the timing isn't coincidental. This happened immediately after the European Union made clear they're prepared to impose secondary sanctions on any nation helping Russia evade existing restrictions. For Kazakhstan, the threat of being disconnected from the US dollar-based global financial system represented an existential economic danger that outweighed any benefits of serving as Russia's logistics backdoor. But here's what makes this truly significant. Since 2022, Kazakhstan has been one of the primary channels keeping Russia's military-industrial complex supplied with the advanced technology it cannot produce domestically. When Western sanctions cut off direct trade routes for critical components, Russia built an elaborate re-export network using neighboring countries as intermediaries. Now that network just got choked at one of its most vital arteries, and the consequences extend far beyond just Russia. This border shutdown is simultaneously devastating Chinese economic interests, undermining Beijing's trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative, and demonstrating the collapsing influence Moscow once wielded over former Soviet states. What follows is an examination of how a traffic jam became a strategic crisis, why modern warfare depends on civilian electronics, and how economic pressure is achieving what military force alone could not. The shadow trade network that kept Russia fighting. To understand why this border closure matters so profoundly, it's necessary to examine the sophisticated system that sustained Russia's military operations since the full-scale invasion began in 2022. When comprehensive Western sanctions severed direct trade routes for critical technologies, Russia didn't simply accept defeat. They constructed an elaborate parallel import system using neighboring countries as intermediaries and disguise layers. Nations like Kazakhstan, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan evolved rapidly into essential nodes in a sophisticated re-export network designed to circumvent sanctions while maintaining plausible deniability. The statistical evidence of this trade diversion is overwhelming and sometimes absurd. While direct United Kingdom exports of sanctioned goods to Russia dropped to virtually zero after the invasion, exports of those identical goods to Russia's neighbors surged by an extraordinary 111% compared to pre-war levels. Someone was buying those goods, and they certainly weren't staying in countries with populations and economies too small to absorb such volumes. Perhaps the most ridiculous example involves trade flows between Gambia and Kazakhstan. Before 2022, these two nations had essentially no trade relationship. They're separated by thousands of miles, share no cultural or historical ties, and produce entirely different goods. Yet official records for 2023 indicated Kazakhstan imported approximately $3 billion worth of goods from Gambia, including machinery, vehicles, and advanced electronics. Gambia doesn't manufacture any of those products. This represents textbook trade diversion. Goods produced in Western or Asian manufacturing centers get shipped through multiple countries to obscure their true final destination, with each transfer adding layers of cost, complexity, and deniability. Kazakhstan, with its extensive border and deep economic connections to Russia, became the primary conduit for this flow, earning billions by serving as the crucial logistical middleman. Why civilian electronics are military weapons? Russia's critical vulnerability lies in its dependence on dual-use technology, civilian products that can be repurposed for military applications. Modern weapon systems, from cruise missiles to surveillance drones, depend fundamentally on advanced microelectronics that Russia's domestic industry cannot produce at necessary scale or quality levels. The sanctions were specifically engineered to sever access to these components. Here's what makes this particularly challenging for Russia. A common civilian item like a basic calculator contains microprocessors sophisticated enough to be extracted and repurposed to guide missiles. Advanced smartphones contain accelerometers, gyroscopes, and GPS chips that can be integrated into drone navigation systems. Commercial drones themselves can be modified for battlefield reconnaissance or even weaponized. Industrial equipment contains programmable logic controllers and sensors applicable to weapons manufacturing. By forcing Russia to acquire these items through convoluted supply chains rather than direct purchase, the sanctions impose what experts call a sanctions tax, a massive markup that dramatically increases the cost of sustaining military operations. A calculator selling for $10 retail might cost the Russian state $20 or $25 after being routed through Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Kazakhstan, with each intermediary taking a cut. Multiply that markup across millions of components, and the financial burden becomes genuinely significant. However, sanctions enforcement has been inconsistent and incomplete. A United States special envoy recently rated Western enforcement efforts at just 3 out of 10, acknowledging that the complexity of the globalized economy combined with insufficient political will allowed these backdoor channels to remain operational. The recent threat of secondary sanctions against facilitators like Kazakhstan represents a strategic evolution, shifting from targeting the end user, Russia, to targeting the enablers throughout the supply chain. The credible threat that changed everything. What transformed this situation from theoretical concern to immediate crisis was the European Union making abundantly clear they're prepared to impose secondary sanctions on nations discovered facilitating Russian sanctions evasion. For Kazakhstan, this threat carried genuine weight because of the country's deep integration into the dollar-based global financial system. Being cut off from that system would be economically catastrophic, far worse than losing revenue from serving as Russia's logistics intermediary. Last month, discussions within EU policy circles indicated strong momentum toward actually implementing these secondary measures rather than just threatening them. For Kazakhstani authorities, the calculation became straightforward: lose Russian transit fees or risk economic isolation from the entire Western financial architecture. President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev chose survival, and the result was an overnight transformation of border procedures from cursory checks to comprehensive inspections of virtually every shipment. This represents Astana sending an unmistakable signal of compliance with Western sanctions to avoid punishing economic measures. The border gridlock isn't an unfortunate side effect, it's the entire point, a visible demonstration that Kazakhstan is serious about enforcement, the collateral damage to China's grand strategy. Here's where this situation creates complications that extend far beyond just Russia. Kazakhstan is the centerpiece of the northern corridor of China's Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing's multi-trillion-dollar global infrastructure project designed to secure reliable trade routes connecting China to European markets. China has invested over $50 billion in Kazakhstani Belt and Road projects alone. In 2024, more than 12,000 freight trains carrying goods valued at approximately $80 billion traveled from China to Europe through Kazakhstan. An estimated 80% of all China-Europe rail freight uses this route. Additionally, a steady flow of trucks, sometimes exceeding 30,000 per month, transports Chinese electronics, automotive parts, and machinery across Kazakhstani highways toward Russia and European destinations. The current border inspections, though specifically targeted at Russia-bound cargo, are causing substantial collateral damage to Chinese economic interests. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Chinese goods are now sitting immobilized in trucks, generating massive financial losses from delivery delays, contract penalties, and potential order cancellations. From Beijing's perspective, Kazakhstan's compliance with Western sanctions is functioning as a de facto blockade on China's most strategically important trade corridor, transforming what was supposed to be a reliable asset into a logistical nightmare. This disruption, a direct consequence of Russia's war in Ukraine, adds to a growing list of problems plaguing the Belt and Road Initiative. It's also a significant embarrassment for both Moscow and Beijing, demonstrating that Western economic pressure can disrupt even China's most ambitious infrastructure projects without directly targeting Chinese interests. The immediate impact on Russia's war effort. The consequences for Russia are both immediate and potentially catastrophic if the situation persists. Domestically, Russian businesses dependent on these imports face devastating delays. With contractual obligations to meet and shipments stuck indefinitely at the border, many companies are approaching bankruptcy. Russian media outlets have voiced alarm and disbelief, with some commentators describing Kazakhstan's compliance as betrayal by a former Soviet partner. Retail shelves are beginning to show gaps where certain imported products have disappeared, and manufacturing lines are temporarily shutting down while awaiting essential components that aren't arriving. The more serious impact, however, concerns military capabilities. While the Russian Ministry of Defense will certainly prioritize access to any critical components that manage to get through, a sustained disruption of this magnitude will inevitably degrade operational capacity. The ability to produce new missiles, repair damaged equipment with modern optics and electronics, and deploy advanced drone systems is directly dependent on the availability of these imported dual-use goods. Short-term slowdowns can be absorbed by drawing on existing stockpiles, but a prolonged stranglehold creates critical vulnerabilities on front lines. Manufacturing rates decline, maintenance backlogs grow, technological advantages erode. This logistical crisis therefore poses a significant long-term threat to the sustainability of Russia's high-intensity military operations in Ukraine, potentially more effectively than any single weapon system Western nations have provided to Ukrainian forces. The crumbling sphere of influence. Perhaps the most significant aspect of this entire situation is what it reveals about Russia's rapidly declining influence within its traditional sphere of dominance. The near abroad of former Soviet states increasingly views Moscow not as a provider of security and prosperity, but as a source of instability and economic risk. One after another, countries like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and now Kazakhstan are diversifying their foreign policies and forging new partnerships with the United States, European Union, Turkey, and China, hedging against overdependence on a declining power. The recent summit in Tajikistan, where Russian President Vladimir Putin met with leaders of former Soviet republics, was less a demonstration of regional authority and more a plea for continued loyalty and open trade borders. A plea that is increasingly being disregarded as these nations calculate that their futures lie in integration with global markets rather than subordination to Moscow's interests. Kazakhstan's decision to enforce Western sanctions, even at significant short-term economic cost, marks the inflection point in this trend. It demonstrates that even Russia's closest neighbors and most economically intertwined partners are willing to prioritize relationships with the West over maintaining the status quo with Moscow when forced to choose. So here's where this unprecedented border crisis actually stands. Kazakhstan just transformed from Russia's most reliable logistics backdoor into an enforcement mechanism for Western sanctions, and the implications cascade across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Over 8,000 trucks remain immobilized, representing hundreds of millions in economic losses and countless critical components that will never reach Russian factories and military facilities. The sophisticated re-export network that kept Russia's military-industrial complex supplied with technology it cannot produce domestically just lost one of its primary arteries. Companies throughout Russia face bankruptcy from supply chain disruptions. Military production rates will inevitably decline if this continues. And perhaps most significantly, China's trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative, specifically its most important Europe-bound trade corridor, is suffering massive collateral damage from a crisis created entirely by Russia's strategic choices. This represents economic statecraft achieving what military pressure alone could not, forcing neutral countries to choose sides by making the cost of facilitating Russian sanctions evasion higher than the benefits. Kazakhstan calculated that maintaining access to Western financial systems and avoiding secondary sanctions outweighed any advantages of serving as Russia's logistics middleman. That calculation will likely be repeated by other countries currently playing similar roles. The empire Vladimir Putin has attempted to rebuild is fragmenting, not primarily because of external military pressure, but from the internal consequences and strategic miscalculations of his own decisions. Former allies are hedging, economic lifelines are being severed, and a traffic jam on a border that most people couldn't locate on a map might ultimately prove more consequential than any single battlefield engagement. The question now is how long Kazakhstan maintains this enforcement posture, whether other countries follow suit, and whether Russia can develop alternative supply routes before critical shortages begin affecting frontline capabilities. The answers will help determine not just the trajectory of the conflict in Ukraine, but the broader balance of power across Eurasia for years to come.